The housing crisis was engineered. How tax law, Wall Street, and political cowardice turned shelter into a financial extraction machine. America's housing crisis did not happen by accident. It didn't arrive like a natural disaster or a market correction or a wave of demographic pressure. It was engineered over decades, built into the tax code, amplified through deregulation, and then weaponized by Wall Street after the 2008 collapse. What we call a housing shortage is not a shortage at all. It is the predictable result of turning shelter into a financial instrument, of turning homes into tax write-offs, and of turning the everyday American into a captive revenue stream for banks and investment funds. The roots of this crisis reach back to 1954. That was the year Congress rewrote the U.S. tax code and gifted real estate investors a loophole so powerful it changed the entire purpose of property ownership. Accelerated depreciation allowed landlords to deduct large fictional losses each year, even if their properties were appreciating. This was not a small technical adjustment. It was the birth of the modern real estate tax shelter. A building could gain $100,000 in value, while the owner simultaneously deducted tens of thousands in wear and tear that never materially occurred. Overnight, housing became more valuable as a tax shield than as a place for a family to live. The loopholes multiplied. In 1981, Reagan's first tax reform supercharged the scheme by shortening depreciation schedules and encouraging investment purely for tax avoidance. What followed was a frenzy of speculative buying, not because the homes were needed, but because the tax code made losing money on paper more profitable than operating in the real economy. The abuse grew so extreme that by 1986 Congress was forced to revise the rules again, restricting some passive loss deductions. But the real estate lobby was powerful enough to preserve the core of the system. Depreciation stayed. The 1031 exchange stayed. The ability to roll profits forward indefinitely stayed. The casino stayed open. For decades, these structural incentives inflated property values, pushed ordinary families out of the market, and herded investment capital toward housing instead of productive industries. Real estate was no longer the bedrock of middle-class wealth. It became a mechanism for the wealthy to avoid taxes, hedge inflation, and endlessly grow their portfolios. The financialization of housing was already underway long before the world even heard the name subprime. Then came 2008, the spark that ignited the powder keg the tax code had packed for half a century. The banks built an empire of toxic mortgages, securitized garbage loans, and bet against their own clients. They caused the collapse. And while millions of Americans lost their homes, the government stepped in not to save homeowners, but to rescue the financial institutions that engineered the meltdown. This is where the story becomes almost too grotesque to believe. The same Wall Street players who caused the housing crash began preparing to profit from its aftermath before the dust even settled. At Goldman Sachs, one of the executives who had made a fortune shorting the housing market, Don Mullen, quietly left the firm. Then he began borrowing from the very same banks whose practices helped cause the crash. He used their freshly bailed-out capital to buy foreclosed homes by the thousands. The man who became rich betting that the American housing market would collapse now became even richer buying up its ruins. He wasn't alone. Blackstone, the largest private equity firm on the planet, began a historic buying spree. It created Invitation Homes and purchased entire neighborhoods of foreclosed properties with cheap capital and government-enabled access. Instead of letting families return to those homes, Wall Street transformed them into rental portfolios, securitized the rent payments, and created an entirely new financial product: single-family rental-backed securities. Homes were no longer shelter, they were yield. Pretium Partners followed the same playbook, eventually amassing control of over 100,000 homes. So did Tricon, Amherst, Progress Residential, and a handful of other mega landlords. These firms had one advantage that the average American family never stood a chance against: They had nearly unlimited capital, near zero borrowing costs, and the political protection that comes when an entire class of investors is already writing the laws that regulate them. By the mid-2010s, Wall Street was no longer a presence in the housing market. It was a dominant force. When a corporation owns thousands of properties in a single metro area, it dictates rent. When it owns tens of thousands across the country, it dictates national rent trends. The result was inevitable. Rents skyrocketed. But the rise in rent wasn't driven by natural market pressures. It was driven by algorithms. Wall Street began using software like RealPage's YieldStar to coordinate rent increases across markets. Humans couldn't legally collude to raise rents in tandem, but software could. The algorithm was designed to push rents up simultaneously, reduce vacancy rates, and harvest maximum yield for investors. Multiple federal lawsuits have already accused these systems of algorithmic price fixing, yet the damage is already done. The rent crisis is not an accident. It is a business model. Local governments benefited from rising valuations. Higher prices meant higher property taxes. Politicians quietly allowed consolidation because it filled municipal budgets. No one asked why property taxes should climb simply because hedge funds were inflating home prices. No one asked why so many homes were being kept vacant. No one asked why families were being outbid in cash by companies with direct lines to the Federal Reserve. The crisis metastasized because every level of government found a way to profit from it. And now, after decades of financialization, tax sheltering, deregulation, and corporate consolidation, the political establishment offers its solution, a 50-year mortgage. Instead of addressing the underlying causes of housing inflation, lawmakers are now proposing that Americans simply extend their debt for an additional 20 years. A 50-year mortgage is not a housing policy. It is a guarantee that the inflated prices created by Wall Street will never come down. It ensures that families will pay interest for half a century, that the banks will extract wealth for half a century, and that the system will remain intact for half a century. This is not reform, it's surrender. A 50-year mortgage exists for one reason: to protect the inflated asset values that now underpin the portfolios of Wall Street landlords, pension funds, private equity firms, and global investors. If prices fell to match wages, the financial system would take losses. So instead of fixing the system, they stretch the chain around your neck. They offer debt instead of justice. They offer a lifetime of payments instead of affordability. They offer survival instead of stability. The truth is simple. Housing in America is no longer built to house people. It is built to feed a financial architecture that depends on ever-rising rents, ever-rising valuations, and ever-expanding debt burdens. The tax code created the incentives. Wall Street exploited them. Politicians protected them. And ordinary Americans were left to pay rent for the rest of their lives or to sign mortgage contracts designed to outlive them. The crisis is not complicated. It is not mysterious. It is not a force of nature. It is the deliberate outcome of a system that treats shelter as a commodity, families as revenue streams, and homes as vehicles for tax avoidance and wealth extraction. Until that system is confronted directly, through tax reform, antitrust enforcement, regulation of institutional landlords, and a redefinition of housing as a public good rather than a speculative asset, the crisis will not end. A nation that once built homes so families could grow now builds policies so investors can extract. The American dream didn't die. It was bought, securitized, and rented back to the people who created it.